Welcome back to the Astrology Report, this time for December 4th through December 10th of 2023. We are almost at the end. If you don't know me already, my name is Cam White. Thank you guys so much for being here. Make sure you like this video, comment, and let me know what you're going to think of this week. But most importantly, make sure you're subscribed because 2024 year ahead horoscopes are coming out this week. So you want to make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss when they come out. Get prepared for 2024. That's all I got to say. This week is definitely more of a vibe shift. I'm not particularly fond of this week. However, there are some good redeeming qualities of this week. So let's just go ahead and jump straight into it. So we're starting Monday off on the 4th with the moon in Virgo, making a trine to Mercury and Jupiter. So I think, again, while the moon's in Virgo, being more organized, detailed, essentially just getting our shit together. Maybe that's cleaning your house. There's a lot of just real good quality earth transits going on. So feeling stable, feeling in control. The moon making that trine to Mercury is like, hey, if we organize ourselves, we can get this kind of plan together. Last week's horoscope, I would have mentioned that it's time to get a plan together. It's time to prepare for 2024. And I think this Mercury retrograde is a good idea to okay, while Mercury is in Capricorn and logistically, both logistically and the way that we're thinking, it needs a system. It needs some sort of regulation. And as Mercury goes retrograde here soon, this is kind of rethinking what that plan is, rethinking what that system is. And I just think as the moon makes that trine to Mercury, this is kind of getting a better idea of what the plan should look like. And then the moon is going to make a trine to Jupiter. So this is kind of like, okay, coming back to that slow and steady wins the race, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. How can we get the most, highest quality item, or, how can we really squeeze the most juice out of, this next year or with this plan? And I think that's a big part of this Mercury retrograde in Capricorn. Mercury will be making a trine to Jupiter this week. So there's a lot of hey, if you have a good plan and you stick to that plan, you will get the results that you're looking for. But then after the moon makes that trine to Mercury and Jupiter, that's all good. The moon is then going to make a square to Mars in Sagittarius, where there's this kind of antsy feeling of I need to go and this isn't going fast enough. And, I've always made fun of the Virgo Sag squares, when you're going hiking, Sagittarius is they'll just walk with whatever. They'll just go. Versus the Virgo people are very do you have your sunscreen? Do you have your walking sticks? Do you have your granola bars? And so the moon in Virgo being so focused on again, more of an emotional connection to feeling prepared, feeling like you've got, crossing all of your T's, dotting all of your I's. With that squaring Mars in Sagittarius, there is a hey, we're burning daylight here. We need to get going. And so even though it's hey, we're getting all these plans together, there is this kind of anxiousness of feeling like things aren't moving fast enough. But the other thing that we have going on Monday, and this is our first highlight of the week, is Venus is ingressing into Scorpio. So I think this is quite a big shift. Just because we had that Venus K2 situation. We had Venus retrograde all over the summer. Then Venus was fallen. Then Venus was in domicile on the South Node. But now Venus is going into detriment. Venus doesn't do well in Scorpio because Venus is about pleasure and joy, and Scorpio is about pain and resentment. And so when you see Venus in Scorpio, the regular ways in which, what people might perceive as pleasure or fun, you kind of have to go unorthodox with it. Venus in Scorpio is finding pleasure through pain. Now, I always say this with my Venus and Scorpio clients. It's and I think I actually mentioned this not that long ago, but when you have Venus in Scorpio and you look it up, it's you're into BDSM and S&M and all that kind of good stuff. And that can be true for, certain people. There's kind of a want or a pleasure for the forbidden or for the extreme. But something I see a lot in my Venus and Scorpio clients is long bouts of celibacy. And this is Venus about pleasure going in Scorpio, where it is about going without pleasure. And if Venus in Scorpio is about having pleasure by going without pleasure, it's kind of long bouts of celibacy. Getting rid of the need for pleasure can be more invigorating. And so while Venus is in Scorpio, really the hack is okay, if you're trying to just enjoy the normal things that you enjoy, you're not going to have a good time. But if you're enjoying more of the process and being okay, let me ratify what it is that I enjoy. Let me enjoy not experiencing, day-to-day pleasures that I'm used to experiencing, because they're not going to be as fulfilling with Venus and Scorpio. Venus and Scorpio is wanting something more intense, wanting something more, again, forbidden or dark. And so as Venus goes into Scorpio, there's this kind of lack of fulfillment in some way. It's the things that you would typically get you off or that you think are nice just aren't doing it for you anymore. And so with Venus and Scorpio, I think the easiest way to go about it is finding pleasure in, not necessarily like the extremes, but rewriting what fun and pleasure looks like for you temporarily. Like, for example, like if you drink sugary coffee every single day and you love it, there might be this point where you're kind of like, I'm a little bit over the sugary coffee thing, and maybe it might be a good idea to go without that. What would it be like to not have that? And maybe enjoying that new experience of not going without the little pleasurable thing that you get on your day-to-day basis. So as Venus goes into Scorpio, it definitely will kind of create a more depressing vibe, just in general. But I find Venus and Scorpio relatively easy to manage and handle. You just have to understand what it's trying to do, or the hack around it, which is, again, the typical things that you might have pleasure in. You kind of have to rewrite what that is temporarily. That brings us to Tuesday. And on Tuesday, the moon, while it's still in Virgo, is going to make a trine to Uranus and go opposite Neptune. So, you know what I typically say here with the moon in Virgo, we're being more organized, planned, detailed. As it makes a trine to Uranus, there's some sort of, again, like, small little idea that helps us out, or some little way to make our system more efficient, easier way to plan and organize things. It reminds me of this. I just saw this Instagram reel of like this woman who invented this like coat hanger that folds in half. So you can like fold your clothes in half and hang it and take up less space. Oh, I thought it was a brilliant idea. That kind of reminds me of, moon in Virgo trining Uranus. It's like a simple little tweak can help you organize things in such a better way. But it will go opposite Neptune after that trine to Uranus. So the moon in Virgo opposite Neptune in Pisces, in my opinion, it's always like, even if you prepare and you prepare and you prepare, let's say for a road trip, and then you get on the road, you just can't help a feeling that you have forgotten something. Like something is missing. I didn't add in something I was supposed to. So sure, you might have had this little kind of innovative, idea that helps you organize things or get things more detailed and planned. But once the moon goes opposite Neptune, you can't like help the feeling that you're forgetting something or that you're not seeing everything clearly. And I think that's okay. I think that emotion will pass. Just don't like stir in it. But then on Tuesday, we have our second highlight, which is Venus making a trine to Saturn. And so while I think Venus is in Scorpio and Saturn being in Pisces, and like I've talked about, if Saturn's about discipline, restrictions, I think that's a big thing. If Saturn's about restrictions and limitations, and it's in this mutable water sign, like where our restrictions are, where we need to be more disciplined is always changing based off our environment, based off the, the temperature of, when I say the temperature, I'm relating more so to water here. And I just think as Venus is in Scorpio making the trine to Saturn, it's like, hey, again, maybe going without this pleasure, maybe rewriting what that is right now is going to help me get a better framework for being more disciplined, being more mature, and working within the restrictions that I have right now. Saturn not being in a fixed sign, like Saturn in a fixed sign is like, hey, this is where you need to be disciplined. That's about it. Saturn in Pisces is like, okay, based off your environment, based off the circumstances, where you need to be more disciplined, more mature, more responsible, as well as what your restrictions are variable, and you have to adapt with that. And I just think as Venus goes into Scorpio, where again, the regular orthodox sense of, what we enjoy or what pleases us is no longer available, and we have to think of alternative ways to get pleasure. I think Venus trining Saturn is a good construct of like, okay, here's another challenge and a new opportunity for me to, again, learn how to be more mature and disciplined and work within the limitations that I have and be able to still thrive in them, if that makes sense. So another thing with Venus trine Saturn is like these kind of changes or going without certain pleasures, are going to be good for us in the long term. And I think it's a nice little challenge. I mean, when Venus goes into Sag, do whatever you want. Venus and Sag is a lot more fun than Venus and Scorpio. It's a lot more wild. So I just think Venus and Scorpio is a little bit more about not necessarily focusing on, again, you're not going to just receive pleasure or have fun in the orthodox ways that you're used to temporarily. It is more fun to do things that might be counterintuitive to pleasure during this time. And that might be like going without those things. And again, I just think as Venus trine Saturn, this is good in the long term in terms of where we need to be responsible, where we need to be more mature. And just like, for example, if you're a night chart and Saturn is a little bit more difficult for you, it's like, hey, you have certain limitations and restrictions that you have to deal with. You can either whine and complain about that, or you can adapt to that environment. And it's like, for example, if like you're in prison and you're not going to get, I mean, like in prison, you can still get pretty much whatever you want. But let's just say hypothetically, you're in prison and you can't get your cookies. Rather than whining all day about like, oh, I can't get cookies, it's just like, okay, stop wanting cookies. And then it'll be a lot easier to deal with once you're in there. That's kind of the way I see this. So I like this, although I would imagine a lot of you will kind of struggle to adapting this at first. The way I see it, though, is that I find this a relatively easy hack this time around. As long as you're open-minded to making some of those changes. While Venus was in Libra on the South Node, maybe some of you have been like thinking about making changes like that. And again, we're going into the new year. It's an excellent time to make some bigger changes with your life anyway. Then we get to Wednesday. And really the only thing that we've got going on Wednesday is the moon is ingressing into Libra. So now the moon being in Libra, we're a lot more connected to relationships and balance and order. I think the issue with that is the ruler of Libra, Venus, is in Scorpio. So while we might want this more balance, we might want to, feel more connected to relationships. Like just Venus is in Scorpio where there's this maybe like angst around trying to connect with people or feeling like you can connect with people all the time, unless it's like on a deep, like super deep level. And so as the moon's in Libra, we are focusing a little bit more on balance, peace, fairness. I think that will be relatively more difficult to achieve with Venus in Scorpio. Like this is kind of our first test of like, okay, if the moon's in Libra and, we want to have a nice little balance of like work and pleasure, this is kind of our first little test of how do we manage that now with Venus in Scorpio. But on Wednesday, the moon will square Mercury. And the way I look at the moon squaring Mercury is while Mercury is in Capricorn and it's like, hey, here's the deadline. Here's the system. Here are the regulations and the parameters we have to work in terms of our ideas, our plans, and the way that we communicate. The moon in Libra making a square to Mercury in Capricorn reminds me of like when you need to fire somebody, like if you were a boss and you need to fire somebody that you genuinely like, you sometimes have to just say things how they are, even if it disrupts the relationship. And, in my opinion, like a more true friend is going to tell you how it is, regardless of how you react to it. And it's kind of up to you to be a little bit more like open to that, like to honesty. But I just think the moon in Libra squaring Mercury and Capricorn is that internal struggle of like, I like this person, but I have to say something just how it is. And, that might make them upset. That might make them unhappy. And what do they think of me? And it's going to be easy to get caught in that. And I think, again, the way out of that is while Mercury is in Capricorn, it's like, hey, sometimes you just have to say what you have to say. That doesn't mean you have to be mean. That doesn't mean you have to be, ruthless and just brutal and cold, because the moon is in the superior position here. And so there is kind of like this, where you might want to say something mean and say it how it is. The moon in Libra is still asking like, hey, you don't have to be like, hey, you're fired, by the way. It's kind of like, hey, you could still, break it to them easy, if that makes sense. Maybe not, as long as it's not compelling you to like, be like, as long as you're not like hesitant on saying what you need to say, I think you'll be in the good. But coming back, and again, the reason I'm even using this analogy is Mercury is communication. Moon in Libra is like more of an emotional connection to somebody. So there is this trying to communicate something with somebody. Now, if we're talking about plans, if we're talking about logistics here, there's a part of it that is, hey, are your plans in balance? For example, if Mercury's in Capricorn where it's like, I'm just going to work, 90 hours this week and no one's going to stop me. The moon in Libra is like, okay, well, what about when you need to like eat food or like when you need to go to sleep or things like that? This is about bringing those things into balance here and not leaning one way too hard or the other. So then we get to Thursday, and on Thursday, the moon, while it's in Libra, will make a sextile to Mars in Sag. Why I like this is while Mars is in Sag and it's a lot more go, 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 very explorative. Our actions are driven by our faith and our philosophy and our hope and our gratitude. I think the moon in Libra making a sextile to Mars in Sag just makes it more hopeful to be like, hey, I've got this kind of plan I'm getting together. I have people that I could share that with, and that is now exciting me for the future. And why I like the moon sextiling Mars on Thursday is because we have our other highlight, which is Mercury making a trine to Jupiter. And this is when it all starts clicking. Now, Mercury will trine Jupiter again when it goes retrograde, and then it'll trine Jupiter way later in like January once Mercury goes back into Capricorn and does that. But Mercury, while it's in shadow, where again, all of these plans and, the infrastructure or the system in which we're going to operate in, or again, even the way that we're communicating, we're going to come back to this. Like, this isn't exactly what the plan is right now. We're still formulating a rough draft. I think as Mercury trines Jupiter, there is this, I'm now seeing how this plan is going to pan out in 2 to 3 years. A way that I almost look at this is like reverse engineering. Like, if you, I've said this for years, if you want to have a goal, like, you need to work yourself backwards from when you achieve that goal back to where you are right now. Because if you say like, okay, well, I want whatever X, Y, and Z in like 2 years, and you're starting from point A and you're trying to think of point B, like, it's not going to make as much sense versus like, okay, like, let's say you want to buy a house in 2 years. Okay, what does it look like to have a house? Okay, you're going to have, unless you want to PMI, you're going to need 20% down. You have to look for a house. You're going to have to find a realtor. You're going to have to scout the location, all of that stuff. You're going to have to get what is it? The person that like checks out the house to make sure it's fine. You're going to have to make sure you get you're qualified for the loan. And when you start there of like, what does it look like to own a house? And then you work backwards on how you got there, it makes it much clearer on what your steps are moving forward. And so I think with Mercury trining Jupiter, it's like, okay, what is the plan for the long run here? And again, this is Jupiter and Taurus. How do I maximize value? How do I take advantage of everything that I have offered to me? And Mercury in Capricorn is like, we are looking at a system. We are looking at a plan. And while Mercury's trining Jupiter, it's like dots are connecting in terms of, here's the plan for the long term and how I can just do slow and steady wins the race, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, kind of an idea. Now, what I think is interesting about Mercury trining Jupiter is this is right before it goes retrograde. So this is like connecting the dots, but maybe realizing where we can be more efficient in our system and maybe reprioritizing things. So it's not like Mercury trines Jupiter and boom, you got the solution, you're good to go. It's like Mercury's going to trine Jupiter. We kind of connect some dots, and then Mercury's going to go retrograde where we do change those plans. Mercury's going to trine Jupiter again, where we're like, okay, how do we write these plans in the most, how do we rewrite these plans, or how do I change the way that I communicate, or how do I, deal with these delays? And even though it's a temporary delay in order to, again, maximize the results, maximize the value. So I think just here, we're just connecting dots in terms of what a rough draft plan can look like for the future in terms of, again, just wherever Capricorn and Taurus is at in your chart. Maybe that's 2nd and 10th house so money and finances and career. Maybe it's for, fifth house stuff of creativity, and your 1st house of you and your body. And, maybe that has to do with kids. Maybe that has to do with sex. Just look at what's going on in your chart essentially. But I look at this as starting to get a plan together and understanding what that might look like in terms of, we're still in the middle of writing our first rough draft. We will not have that final draft until January of 24, when Mercury is direct out of shadow trining Jupiter, where now we're moving forward and now we're more in the completion phase of it. This is just trying to get the idea of, okay, what does that actually look like? And I think that's where the dots get connected on Thursday. Then we get to Friday. The moon is going to conjoin the South Node in Libra and then ingress into Scorpio and trine Saturn. Again, I think the moon conjoining the South Node is similar to the Venus in Scorpio or Venus in Libra transit, where Venus in Libra on the South Node is like, okay, I might have these nice things. These are all great, but they're not fulfilling to me anymore. And I don't want them. The moon in Libra, where again, our emotions are really connected. Like, I just want some balance. I just want, why can't I, have my perfect little diet and also have my sweet little snacks and treats? And moon conjoining the South Node is like, again, I've just been using the analogy for the North Node in Aries and the South Node in Libra. It's like peace was never an option. Like, it's not going to be easy to have balance during this time. It'd be different when the North Node is in Libra, where it's like, hey, that's all we want is this balance and this order. The moon conjoining the South Node is realizing, like, at certain times in your life, things are going to be out of balance. And I think that's okay. But I think the more that you try to resist that, the more difficult it's going to be. But then after the moon conjoins the South Node, it will ingress into Scorpio, where there's this, again, feeling of like helplessness. And the moon's going to be conjoining Venus in Scorpio, where it's like, your first couple of days of, let's say, going without caffeine or sugar, it's like tumultuous. You're like, I'm just craving this. And it's all I can do. And it's all I can think about. That's what the moon in Scorpio connecting to Venus and Scorpio reminds me of. I think another way to look at it, though, is like feeling that, like, you know, not just ignoring it, but like saying like, okay, I can feel this emotion. I can feel this sense of I'm not getting what I want. And it is uncomfortable, but I'm not going to allow this feeling to make me react. Like, I'm going to be aware of this feeling, knowing that this is what it's going to feel like, and know that I just have to get out of this. It's the same thing, you know, like I know I'm smoking cigarettes right now, but I've quit before. You know, you get past like the first 3 days of quitting smoking sucks, and you just kind of have to sit in it. And then it's like, but by the time you get to the third day, you're fine, really. And that's how I kind of look at this, is like, okay, if this is your first day, like quitting smoking, it's going to suck, but just get to day 3. And once you get to day 3, you will not feel that way. And you just have to know that that feeling will end at some point, especially when you're relinquishing something that you find pleasurable, that you find fun. And I think the other thing is, as the moon conjoins, Venus, actually, I might have messed this up. On Friday, the moon ingresses into Scorpio in trine Saturn, where it is a little bit more like, okay, you know that this is a part of the game in terms of disciplining yourself, being more mature, responsible. It's a part of this adaptive nature. And it's not till Saturday, Parker changed the thing. This is what I'm talking about, Saturday. That's when the moon conjoins Venus, where that's more of like the, I hate sitting in this uncomfortability. It's not that fun. And so the Friday-Saturday vibe is very similar. But once we do get to Saturday, this is when the moon will conjoin Venus. So we have that uncomfortability feeling. And then the moon's going to go opposite Jupiter. Where as the moon is opposite Jupiter, there's this real kind of like, is the pain worth, the reward at the end? And I think you're going to get really triggered here in terms of like, gosh, like, this sucks so bad. I could just pick up a cigarette, or I could just, go get my sugar, or go get my fix, whatever it is. That moon in Scorpio is like the pain and the emotional uncomfortability is at odds with like, hey, what is the most valuable thing long term? And I would really suggest, not going backwards. You don't want to, but man, you're going to be debating it. You're going to be debating it on Saturday of like, oh, this uncomfortability and, where I want to go and how I want to do things. Is it worth, because again, Jupiter's retrograde. You may not be able to see that bigger picture. You may not be able to like have that faith there. And so I would really urge you guys to just at least have the awareness of what you're going through on Saturday in terms of like, I'm uncomfortable with this. I don't like this. And it's making me want to result back to my happy place in my comfort zone because I just can't see the long term here. It's like, again, if you've ever detoxed, like I've never been an alcoholic, but like my whole fucking family is, you can die if you're getting sober from alcohol. If you're a real alcoholic, not saying some of you aren't, but like if you're a fucking real alcoholic, you could just straight up die if you don't have alcohol, which is so mind blowing to me. And it's so much easier to like, especially when your life is on the line, to just be like, I'm so uncomfortable. I need to go get my fix. I can't see that long term. And so at least just, again, maybe you do go back. I would suggest not to, but at least be aware if that's what you're going through. If you're like, your emotional uncomfortability is questioning the reward at the end of the tunnel and if it's worth it or if it's even achievable. But then after that, the moon's going to make a sextile to Mercury in Capricorn. And I'm talking to my fucking self right now, by the way. The moon sextiling Mercury is like, if you just stick to the plan, you will get the results that you want. If you just like make things very simple and organized and don't overcomplicate it, things can work out. And I think that moon going opposite Jupiter then sextiling Mercury is just reminding yourself this is a part of the process. And yes, Mercury is going to go retrograde. These plans are going to change. The way that you are doing things is going to change. But the other way I look at it is the moon in Scorpio making a sextile to Mercury while it's in shadow is like maybe realizing, okay, how can I somewhat reframe these plans in times where I am this emotionally distressed or I am this emotionally uncomfortable? Like, do you have a system for that? Like when you have an urge, like let's say you're sober for 2 or 3 weeks, you're doing good, and you have that urge, something gets triggered for you. What is your plan and process to not relapse? That's like how I look at this moon sextile Mercury is like, this is a good awareness day to figure out what are the other things that you can do to not get into that mindset. And the other thing is on Saturday, we get our next highlight, which is Venus going opposite Jupiter. And this is really similar where Venus in Scorpio is like, again, struggling with what it wants. And it's at odds with Jupiter and Taurus. And Jupiter is in Venus's sign. So Jupiter is saying, like, what do we really value here? What does pleasure actually look like for us? What do we actually want to feel? And the ruler of Jupiter, Venus, is in detriment in Scorpio, where it's like, well, I don't want to feel this way. And it's at odds with one another, where, again, how we, like, the things that we want don't necessarily line up and are at exact odds with, like, what our beliefs are. And so there's this kind of cognitive dissonance isn't the right word, but that's very similar to being like, okay, I'm tuned into this feeling, and I don't really like it. What do I do here? And I think a lot of the Venus and Scorpio stuff is just being able to say, hey, I have to honor this moment for what it is. And it isn't comfortable. I don't like it, but let me have fun and joy and pleasure in going through something so extreme. You know what I mean by that is, like, if you've ever done any, let's just say trauma work, for example. I know that term just is very loosey-goosey nowadays. It's painful when you have to relive something. And most people avoid it their whole lives. That's why they drink. That's why they do drugs. That's why they do everything but the things that they want to do, because they don't actually want to confront the, shit in the back of their minds, and they would rather run away and escape from it. However, when you do confront that and you do, like, again, face that, as painful as it is also just like, it's liberating in the sense where it gives you the ability to feel like you can do anything else. Because it's like, if you can face the trauma in your own life, if you can face the own bullshit that you went through and actually recognize it for what it was, then anything's really possible. It gives you this kind of high. And so that's how I look at this Venus and Scorpio opposite Jupiter and Taurus, is like, hey, for example, if you invest, sometimes the market goes down. Are you just going to pull out all your cash? Like, are you going to buy at the top, sell at the bottom? Or are you going to ride that bottom and it's going to hurt, it's going to suck, but the stock market only goes up? That's kind of the vibe here. So it is going to be uncomfortable, but there's so much hope at the end of the day. You just have to stick it through. And then we get to Sunday, and the moon will be in Scorpio going opposite Uranus and trining Neptune. Again, I don't think it's going to be as intense on Saturday, but the moon in Scorpio opposite Uranus and Taurus is like a mixed bag of, one, again, having that triggering, like, quote unquote relapse energy of, like, or for example, like, going back to that investing analogy, it's like, okay, let's say you have like 5,000 in the S&P. It's like, okay, maybe you don't pull out all 5,000, but you pull out like $1,000, like just a little, let me get a little hit. You know what I mean? Let me feel a little more secure and safe. That's one way I would look at it. And again, that may not be a good idea. The other way I look at it is, sometimes you just have to be like, so like, this might force you to be like, I need to do something about this, where it's like, I can't just, if you're, again, especially going through like a detox, or for example, if you're investing and you're just looking at your computer screen, looking at the numbers going down, you can't just sit there and doom about like the numbers going down. Like, go get outside, do something to get your mind off of that. And I think that's what the moon opposite Uranus would be good for, is just like, let's just get rid of this. Let's get out of here and do something else. And then the moon will make a trine to Neptune. Now, again, on one perspective, if you're like, okay, I can't take this anymore, let me just get a little bit, there's like this kind of, again, feeling of shame and regret. That's the moon in Scorpio. And as it trines Neptune, also, there's this kind of like, we as human beings can justify anything. And it's sometimes one of the most sickening things about us, but it's also one of the funniest things about us. Like, I love hearing people's justification stories, because they're all just excuses. But they're so creative all the time. And I'm full of them, by the way. You're talking to someone who's not perfect whatsoever, but at least I have the fucking awareness. And that's pretty much the first step. And then the actual taking action of it is like the much more difficult thing. But luckily, I talk about this every week, so I'm kind of forced to do it more often. But the moon, going opposite Uranus is like, oh, let me just like sneak in one cigarette. And then the moon trine Neptune is like, well, if I just have one cigarette, only on weekends that end with a Y, and, at 8 p.m., then maybe I could be okay. There's a lot of like justification happening here. That's more of a negative way I look at it. The other way I look at it is, give yourself something to do and live in, like, if you, for example, if you're just freaking out, like you're in this uncomfortable feeling, and let's say you just go outside, and I like playing Frisbee golf. The moon in Scorpio trining Neptune is just like, be delusional about how fun Frisbee golf is. I fucking love Frisbee golf. But maybe if it's not your cup of tea, like the moon in Scorpio trining Neptune is like, find some sort of a delusion that can help you escape that negative feeling, right? Like I can't think of an example, but I've heard so many people's like thought processes of how they justify not doing something and what they do instead. And that's almost the way that I would look at Sundays, like being creative with how you see the situation, and like not just being so stuck in your emotions, but being like, okay, like, Moon and Scorpio trining, Neptune and Pisces. It's fun. I love, coming, like, withdrawing off of drugs and alcohol, and it's super fun. And yeah, like it's super, but like, you enjoy it at some level. Like, those are your two options on Sunday: either justify like the negative behaviors and the relapses, or justify being delusional about finding a way to not do those things that you don't want to do, that you're trying to stop. And that brings us to next week. We have Venus sextiling Mercury yet again in Scorpio and Capricorn. I like it. We have the new moon in Sagittarius. This is the time to really get clear about what our point B is, what our point C is, what our vision is. We have Mercury stationing retrograde, where it's now that we have a clear idea of where our vision is, let's get the plans, changed for that. And then the Sun squares Neptune, where it's just kind of like, hey, you got to be creative with, you have to be hopeful and grateful that you will hit that vision, even though it seems so far away from you. So we'll talk about that next week. Like I said, make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, to make sure you get notifications for the 2024 year ahead horoscopes, which are coming out this week. With that being said, I love and appreciate you guys, and I'll be seeing you next time.